Peter hiểu đây.
Siobahn, she.
Oscar hiểu đây. Taran hiểu đây.
Molloy. A specter is haunting the mayoral elections of Franklin, Tennessee, the specter of communism. With that tantalizing hint of our case, I'm going to move into setup. So in this debate, we're talking about groups at the margins of political discourse. That is to say, groups whose issues are basically not discussed at all in national politics, whose issues and perspectives are not covered in the media. We think we're talking about people like Marxists in the United States, like 1080 conspiracy theorists in New Zealand, honestly also the American Green and Libertarian parties. Importantly in this debate, we're not talking about groups like African Americans or Maori people in New Zealand. They are not at the margins of discourse because their issues are talked about in politics all the time. They are arguably on the margins of enfranchisement and power, but they are certainly not on the margins of discourse. We're talking about the truly dispossessed, those whose ideas get no airtime in traditional politics at all. What we need to do in this debate is put ourselves in the minds of these groups and consider their priorities. Because if you're a Marxist or an anarcho-syndicalist, what do you believe? Yes?
Oh, no.
You believe that the entirety of political discourse, down to its very fundamental axioms, requires a paradigm shift. It all needs to be torn down and built back up again from the very base level of how people think about the world. If you're a Marxist who thinks that capitalism should be torn down, and an anarcho-syndicalist who thinks the state shouldn't exist, or some other such group, that's what you believe. What we're going to argue in this debate is that the best way from your perspective to achieve that paradigm shift isn't to start at the very top in national politics and get repeatedly beaten down, not get any airtime and not achieve anything, but to start a grassroots movement that changes hearts and minds at the local level, that starts winning incredibly localized elections, and over a long period of time builds up sufficient attention to ascend to the national scale. So what we support is things like the American Marxist Party, if such a thing exists, picking a bunch of really small-scale fights that it can win, trying to win those fights. When it wins those fights, using those official positions of influence to spread the message of the party, and gradually build up. Importantly, if you're a person who's so single-mindedly committed to the vision of an ideology like this, you don't mind waiting on timescales of 100 or 150 years or more to actualize your vision, and you're willing to take the first steps to bring the great arc of history away from capitalism and towards Marxism. So essentially what I'm going to do in this speech is to provide you a variety of systematic analysis why this strategy as a means of implementing Marxism is more likely to succeed than going right into national politics. Okay, so the first argument is that you really have no ability to break into the national media ecosystem, which is fixated on the standard partisan issues of the day because that's what people like to read about. By contrast, local news media is typically starved for stories because most small-town gossip is pretty boring, and is willing to run stories about wacky candidates with new ideas, which allows you to get the airtime in those local communities that lets you start winning influence and start winning votes. In addition, though, you're not necessarily reliant on media at all in local elections, because in like a local county board election, where the margin tips by a dozen votes each time, door knocking and face-to-face canvassing are incredibly effective at achieving political change. You don't need to fundraise a ton of money to run like TV ads. You don't need to break into the national media ecosystem. You can avoid that entirely. The second argument then is that local politics is to a significant extent in many parts of the world departisanized, and that national party politics doesn't extend down to the local level. So the problem with breaking into national level voting is that people's national votes are pretty fixed by enduring party affiliations that are also highly heritable from generation to generation, and people aren't as willing to consider new ideas when they're like brought up in a particular tribal party identity. By contrast, in local elections, like America recently might be an exception, but in most parts of the world, national parties don't really interfere that much, and therefore people are open to being persuaded by resonant new ideas that really resonate with them and speak to them about how the world works and what the injustices they face are. That means that you're much more able to break into the political discourse. The third is, we would just make the factual observation that local politics is pretty wacky and lots of nut jobs get elected all the time. And the reason for this is because relatively few people run in these elections and relatively few people vote. Turnout is pretty low, which means that the outcomes are actually quite random and can easily be tilted in the scale of kind of a nut job candidate from time to time. Even if you win an election by random chance, though, that's still incredibly valuable for you because then you can use that position of influence, the local microphone that gives you, to start reaching a lot more people, and that massively enhances your product in the long term. I'm happy at any point to take a POI from opposition. Okay. The fourth question. Yeah.
What kinds of issues do local governments keep to manage?
So you can run like a Marxist platform in local elections, right? You can say that you should use tax revenue to build like a miniature local sovereign wealth fund, or that like you should change the structure by which like licenses to companies are allocated, or the local taxation structure. There are lots of ways in which paradigm shift like ideas can be operationalized even at a local level. But even insofar as you're not able to affect policy change literally at the local level, the mere fact that they give you a microphone to broadcast your ideas is still incredibly intrinsically valuable. You might vote as like a standard Green Party or Labour Party candidate all the time when you're actually elected to the position. But if you choose to use all of your speeches, to use your contacts with the local media who will run stories by you because you're in a position of authority to talk about Marxism and talk about Marxist ideas, that starts to win hearts and minds even independently of policy victories. And importantly, again, most local people don't really know what the powers the council has anyway. So if someone comes to them and starts talking about how capitalism is bad and Marxism is really good, if that resonates with them, they're probably willing to vote for that candidate, even if, like, actually there's not much the candidate can do policy-wise to operationalize that vision. So the final mechanism that will bring this debate is that in local elections, like, these elections have much more of a communitarian and personalized feel to people. They feel much more like just talking to your friends and neighbors than national elections do. And that means that charismatic candidates can be incredibly successful, even independently of other disadvantages they face, like lack of funding or like lack of access to the media. What that means is that essentially you can just marshal really charismatic, nice people who are good at talking to other people to start winning elections. Realistically, in this debate, the 1080 party is not going to remake New Zealand ever. But from the perspective of someone who is willing to devote their life to actualizing that vision, it is more likely to happen through a grassroots effort that begins at local politics than repeatedly bashing your head against the wall in national media and never getting any attention. Incredibly proud to propose.
From government so far is that they've accepted that many of the groups we're talking about in this debate have strong political motives and political incentives. Motives that are best met through engaging in national government, through national policies changing, and through general ideas at the national level shifting. When those groups exit from national politics and they go elsewhere, they go to smaller local politics, not only do we tell you they don't actually get any of the benefits of more airtime, more engagement that you wanted to tell you, but that even if they did, that power and that attention is meaningless and powerless to them because there is no ability for them to get any of the change that they wanted, but they lose the opportunity cost of at least trying and engaging within that national sphere. What am I going to do for you in this debate? First of all, I'm going to talk to you about what I think these people care about in this debate and who they are. Second, I'm going to talk about why we think things they care about are really only ever realised on that national stage and can never be done with the kind of factor that we heard from the Prime Minister. And finally, I'm going to talk to you about how we actually engage with people and change those hearts and minds in this debate. No, thank you. Okay, so who do we think we're talking about in this debate? I mean, Shakked obviously set that up in terms of we're talking about really fringe groups. Fringe obviously being contingent on the country that you're in. So in some countries, fringe is just going to mean like those small parties that never get any airtime because you're essentially in the two-party system. It looks like, apparently, like your conspiracy theorists, like people who are Marxists, or in some countries, maybe like even socialists, who are on the fringe of the economic discourse there. The important thing to note about all of those groups is that their aims are political, and they're often their aims are political at a really broad level, right? Like at a libertarian, if you are part of the Libertarian Party in, say, the United States or somewhere, you don't have small-time goals about like changing local government. You are fundamentally interested in getting big national government out of the houses and out of the private lives of your individual citizens. The worst atrocities in your mind that the government does and the most overreach obviously occurs at that national level. You hate that more, right? And like at a conspiracy theorist level, right? Like you want just them to just stop announcing lockdowns or whatever. That's something that you can't actually get through local government change. You are usually angry at like, the big people of power, and you do need to engage with them there, right? And so we think that's important context in this debate. What does that mean then in terms of whether these people are actually able to get that kind of change, right? Because they actually need to engage in national politics to have any kind of ability to engage in that meaningfully. What do we think that engagement looks like under the status quo? Why do we not think it was quite as dire as Shakked wanted to tell us, right? We don't think it's true that these groups get no attention whatsoever, right? In fact, basically all the reasons Shakked told you that you'll get attention in local government, we think are probably nearly equally true to national government as well, right? People are interested in running funny, like, interest stories, right? They want clickbait. You've got to write about, like, Gareth Morgan wanting to ban cats because that is, like, wacky and out there and gets attention. If there's, like, some very kind of odd sort of person who's eccentric who gets some good quotes, and you can put that insane quote on a headline and get 1 million clicks. That's still the kind of thing that you're going to do at that national level and get you engaging with that, right? And sure, it might not look at this stage like any policy change, but it might still look like reputable news outlets publishing your your news releases at times of campaigns when your issues are being discussed. It might look like your politician being asked, so-and-so has claimed this policy, what do you think about that? And you're getting that media attention in that way, and you're engaging there in that kind of space, right? That's important. Crucially, then, how does that differ from local government, given that we think probably your airtime is substantially similar under either side of the house? Right. Two things are important there. First, the audience and the people that you're engaging with at the national sphere is far more important to you and far larger. Far more people tune into national news just because it is more important to their life, and it's just more likely to be the big kind of news that they read. In times of elections in particular, we think large swathes of the population tend to be tuning in to public news. We also think that even to the extent that we only listen or read local news, particularly, in certain times when big things are happening, big national news is going to feature in your local paper or in your local news, and it's still going to be important to you there. The importance of that is that it's reaching far, far more people who have far more ability to spread your ideas and to hear that. But also importantly, you're likely to target a broader group of people to counter misinformation against you, right? So if you are, say, a socialist in America, there is a great amount of rhetoric coming from, say, the Republican Party about what being a socialist is, about how dire it is, about how desperate and evil that is. Those are people who are able to talk to a national audience, slandering and tarnishing the things that you stand for. You talking to like a tiny, tiny subset of the population to try to counter that misinformation is not particularly valuable to you. What is valuable to you is that attempt to go out there and talk and to counter that more directly. The second thing that I've already alluded to that we think is more important in engaging in national politics is that is where your actual power lies, right? That is where the things that you want to do are actually able to change. You actually look stupider if you are like a person who has these goals that can really only be solved on the national level, and you run for local government, and someone just asks asked you, well, like, what are you going to do? How are you going to get those changes? And you have no answer. You just look even more like an eccentric fool who cannot actually engage with that, which we think is particularly
Siobahn.
harmful to you. Yes, you could.
Getting like a funny news story every presidential election doesn't give you a path upwards, right? It doesn't winning very small elections and then slightly larger elections and then slightly larger elections give you a clear 100-year path to implementing communism.
Okay, so we also disagree that that is also a realistic path, right? We think that it actually what happens is you just get stuck and trapped in that local government cycle, right? Because first of all, we just think it's incredibly unlikely that even if you ran like a local government campaign and got some traction, you would actually win. We don't think that like local government campaigns are like so missing in good candidates that like someone would elect a 1080 candidate. We just don't think that's likely. You're not likely to have that particular pathway going forward, right? But we also think that often local government you end up kind of getting trapped by the fact that you can't get that traction, right? So when you come in with these big grand ideas that make funny headlines to get you elected, and then you fundamentally fail to deliver because there's literally no way for you to do that in local government, and you actually spend your whole time just like voting on the normal tax stuff and the normal rate stuff and the normal infrastructure stuff, that you can't admit that's what you're probably going to do. People are going to become bored of you, you're not going to be interesting or funny, and you're not going to make those funny headlines in the future, and anyone who did have any respect for you and did agree with you is more likely to see you as a sellout and someone they're not interested in engaging with anymore. Fundamentally, the people that we're talking about in this debate have often been slandered on the national stage. In order to get any traction, they must respond on the national stage. That's where their real change happens. That's where they don't get stymied. That is what is best for them.
She had spent a substantial part of her own speech trying to explain to me who Rocky de la Fuente is. I still don't know, but apparently there's this like weird dude that runs in like the Democratic presidential primaries every year on this like weird platform and gets one funny news story and is never spoken of or heard from again. Right? Because that's what it looks like when you try and engage on national level politics as a fringe candidate that is outside the mainstream political discourse. Even at their very best, what they get is like one vote from you being brought up as like a socialist or whatever, and then the Fox News reporter launching into like a 2-minute rant about how socialism bad, rah, 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 and then no one ever speaking about you or hearing of you again until maybe you decide to like try and muster up the ability to run in another 4 years' time. What does our world look like? It looks like you being able to attain a seat on like your local county board or like school district planning commission, or like whatever you're trying to run. It looks like you then, for the next however many years of your term, being in like regular meetings and consultation with the people who live in your area. It looks like you being able to enact your policies, admittedly on a small scale, but to actually get something done. It looks like you're having the ability to talk to your constituents, to change their hearts and minds, to meet regularly with like newspaper editors and journalists, even at the local level, to continue to expand your message further, and then to be able to help get other candidates elected, and over time, gradually bring about the dream of like American communism or 1083 New Zealand, or whatever it is you're trying to get. What am I going to do in my speech today? Firstly, I'm going to like deal directly with their side's material about how the ability to get national outreach by involving yourself in national politics is apparently possible. And then secondly, I'm going to tell you about all of the various benefits that Shakked told you will get at a local level when we start running in these races instead, and why that's a much better option. So firstly then, on the issue of national outreach. Look, basically their mechanism was because national elections are so much higher stakes, and at the end of the day, national media that also looking at stories, you get a story that 50 million people might watch, which far outweighs anything you do in Tulsa County or whatever. Why is that not true? Firstly, national media are just different from local media. One, they're not starved for stories in any capacity. They've got gazillions of things happening across the world that they can run stories on, so they don't need to look for the weird Marxist guy trying to be president. Two, they just have no, they just do not give you any chance of winning, because, spoiler alert, you have no chance of winning, so there's just no reason for them to run a story on you, unlike local politics where you stand a chance. And then thirdly, as I talked about a lot at the start of the speech, even if they do run a story on you, that's just a 1-2 second soundbite where they probably roast you and never talk about you again, right? What does the alternative look like when you're mentioned by local media? Well, even if they do exactly the same thing and give you a 2-second soundbite, you're physically in that community where you can talk to people, you can follow up on that discourse. You see your neighbor in the street and they're oh yeah, I saw you on the TV, and you're yeah, this is what I was talking about, this is why it's important, you have a chance to explain it further. You can hold a rally in the town square if you think they've misrepresented what you were saying, and be boycott the local magazine because they lied or whatever. Your ability to continue the discourse is massively increased. So even if the coverage is exactly symmetrical, which it just never is, then you still get a much better follow-up on that under our side of the house at a local level. Secondly, then on national outreach, they told you that because you have paradigm-shifting global world order type goals, you'll never be taken seriously if you're running at a local level. What are the various reasons this is just completely wrong? One, we think that just you can action a lot of things at a local level. If you're the Ban 1080 party and you run for local council and ban them from dropping 1080 in your local path, goal achieved, you've got some way towards your goal, right? Or Shakked talked about a sovereign wealth fund or something, you can apparently do you can do this stuff. But secondly, we tell you that they wanted to characterize this as you have purely political goals and that your objective is for enhanced policy at a national level. That's not actually the case, right? We tell you that most of all, when you're in a fringe political discourse group, you want to be heard, you want to be listened to, and you want to change the hearts and minds of people, because you're not just trying to make policy changes. You think that global society needs a paradigm shift in the way that it views the world and the way that it operates, right? That's something that just convincing 100 people in your county goes a lot longer towards achieving than getting a 2-second soundbite on CNN, right? We think that you care, I'll take a moment, care much more about the ability to win over the hearts and mind of your local community and use that as a springboard to further your agenda. Yes.
I told you that you were saying a socialist, whether you go to national media or not, that national media will tarnish the name of socialism and deeply misrepresent it. But we need to engage with those same people who are being misinformed to correct them to have any chance in the future of changing their hearts and minds.
Well, you just said that whether you engage with them or not, they're going to say the same stuff about you, right? And it's not you suddenly gain this leverage over them to make them tell the truth when you're running for president with a 0.01% chance of getting one electoral vote. So they're still going to be saying the same shit about you. The only difference is now there's a video of you in a compromising position that starts it when you make a gap or say something that they then take out of context and roast you for. You're not any better off. You don't get to change the hearts and minds of the nation. Whereas all the material I brought you about how you're able to hold a local paper to account or discuss it further with other people means that at local media that's much more successful. Finally, what did Shakked spend a long time explaining to you is the reason we win this debate. It's because you're able to succeed at a local level, because you get much better news coverage, and because just again, local politics is really whack, right? Dogs get voted mayor and stuff. Siobahn could just say, oh, you'll never win. Lots of weird stuff happens. We think you have a much better chance of winning. The effect of that, one, as I told you at the start of my speech, is you get continued airtime, continued ability to build up a movement. You actually have some sort of admittedly nebulous path to actually advancing any part of your agenda, which is more than anything they were ever able to bring us. We brought you lots of mechanisms why you never get the coverage to have even a slight chance of doing this at the national level. So, both sides agree that people that are like on the fringes of politics have one thing that they care lots and lots and lots about, right? We've told you that it's possible for them to do this, even at a minor level, when they run for local politics, because they have a chance of winning. That's why we're proud to propose.
Let's step back and think for a moment, because by their own analysis, what they required was fundamentally changing the way that people view the world and think. The examples that they gave you were things like upending the capitalist system and putting in place a socialist system. The issue with that is that they then relied on a number of people, being able to be convinced of that, but all of those people existing within a very small geographic location. What we told you is that you're much more likely to find people who agree with you, or have people who that idea resonates with, across a much wider geographic location, and the only way you can get access to that is if you are able to get on national news. You are never going to win a local election because the chances are is that the local area you live in, probably 99% of the people don't agree with your viewpoint. What am I going to talk to you about today? There's really just one point: who gets the most change, but I'm going to try and artificially separate it into a few, so we'll look at that. Alright, firstly, what we want to talk to you about is the positive reasons why we think you are able to effect change on a national level, and I want to talk you through mechanistically how that happens. The first point here has been well traversed in terms of media airtime and why you're able to get that. We think that's for two reasons. We think that's because news has an incentive to publish stories that are interesting and that seem absurd or seem shocking to the majority of readers. That's not necessarily to all of them. That's why everyone knows that Gareth Morgan hates cats, whereas many people know very few about his actual policies. The reason that's important is that when newspapers publish that, even if they do so in a critical way, people still read it and they understand the principle behind it. So even if it says we hate cats, often there'll be something justifying it, or Gareth Morgan will come up and talk later. I'll take you about 4 minutes. So, why is that important? We think that you don't necessarily need to engage with the actual words that are said, but the sort of principle behind it, which means you're likely to get people who get on board. The way that translates to national policies is that a disparate group of people throughout the country, say the United States, are able to see that story, which gets more coverage, latch on and message you or find an organisation you have and say, look, I agree with you. That bands together people across the country. If you focus on a local level, you necessarily don't have access to that group because all you get is your little article in I don't know what the equivalent of any of the local newspapers are. Second point, let's look at actually how you change national politics and why this is a unique time not to go down the road that they do. Siobahn alluded to this in her speech. The context about this is that in the current global climate, politicians are in a unique scenario where they're more likely to listen to conservative or alt-right or fringe groups than they were ever before. Why is that? That's because we've seen the rise of the alt-right and what happens when you ignore people and shut them down. That's why you hear Biden saying he's going to reunify America. You hear Jacinda say, I'm going to govern for all of New Zealand. All of the leaders across the world are realizing that they need to engage in minority and fringe groups more and more, otherwise what happens is you lead to violence. We think, therefore, there is an ear and a unique opportunity for fringe groups to actually talk to those politicians and to try and get change in that way. The final mechanism that we have is what's called anchoring. So we think that you might not necessarily get the policy that you want straight away, so you might not get the Marxist utopia Shakked wants, but what the Green Party or whatever left-wing party that is able to say, if you've got, is say, look, that party is extreme, we're not as extreme, and put in place a slightly softer version or a softer version of that. That's how I'll take you then.
Okay, so a few weeks ago, Taran sent me an article about an Indian Marxist who won like a local school board election. And that was so notable that it made the international media. So doesn't winning local elections actually let us co-opt your national media mechanism by getting national coverage when Marxists win local elections?
I'm going to talk about why you're unlikely to win the local elections soon, but essentially we think that that might be the minority of cases and it's not going to necessarily lead to the change anyway. Alright. So what was the point there? We think that they're able to sell it as a more reasonable thing, that the other parties, the more mainstream parties, are able to do that. So, importantly to note here at the end of this point is we think there are a variety of mechanisms where you can talk to politicians, find other people with similar interests, and have media cover you in a relatively reasonable way. What that results in is actual policy change that affects the whole nation. Also note here that when they wanted to talk about you've got grassroots and you're changing everyone that way, that's actually a symmetric point to our side of the house, because it's not like you lobby the national government by yourself. You're more likely to go out and get signatures for petitions and things like that, which means you're necessarily engaging in the same kind of grassroots activities as they are to try and affect change on a larger scale. Alright, let's look at why local is never going to work and why it's not going to change over time. First point about this. They say, essentially, they hang their hat on the idea that when you change each small area over time, you're able to get a path to national politics eventually, so they agree that that's what is desirable. What we say is that actually it's the opposite, because once you've got into local government, people see you as in a position of power within the institution, and they expect radical change really quickly. What you'll notice is when people promise radical change, like Jacinda Ardern, it's incredibly difficult to do that. Because the reality is that it's not easy to change things. So the moment you do that, your whole movement sees you as a sellout. They see you as someone who's not actually living up to the values that you preach. What that does is erode confidence in the movement, or whatever fringe views you have, and people are no longer engaging in it. That's why it doesn't spread across many local governments. Instead, what happens is you maybe get one term re-elected, and then your movement dies out. The next thing to note here is what I alluded to in my introduction, which is essentially the idea that you're in a very small, isolated geographic area. And for example, you might be in a rural area, or you might even be in Wellington Central, or somewhere that's quite progressive. We think that what you have to rely on to get elected there, or to create any change, is a lot of people within that small geographic area holding your viewpoint. We think it's much more likely that people across the country will hold it at a significant scale. At the end of what this debate has proved is that maybe we have a smaller chance that a policy will be put in place than you are elected to mirror at their best case scenario. But the reality is that that policy is more meaningful, and we think in actual fact you're more likely to get it.
have two gripes with the opening half of this debate so far. The first is that a really broad debate about the whole spectrum of political strategy and tactics has collapsed down into a very narrow debate about local electoralism versus national electoralism. So the first of our two contributions in closing government is to step past electoralism entirely and go into the broader debate of contesting elections versus direct action. We're going to talk to you why structurally a lot of the issues that attract people to fringe politics are ones that are structurally suited to direct action rather than either form of electoralism. Of course, as Shakked pointed out, there are some kinds of issues where local electoralism does help, and sure, he gets the credit for those, but we tell you there are far more where neither local nor national electoralism is going forward. Our second contribution is to move a bit past this very narrow focus of what kind of fringe politics we're talking about here, basically 1080 and communists coming up, so fringe views in Western liberal democracies. We're going to talk about how a lot of fringe political movements are generally ones that actually challenge the existence of the institutional status quo itself, and in those contexts, their best support is based on abstentionism from all state institutions entirely. We're basically going to talk about Sinn Féin for a little while. It'll be great. But before we do all that broader stuff, I'm just going to also talk a little tiny bit back into the main things we heard about opening. Like I said in my introduction, we think local electoralism is a narrow solution to some situations. We're just going to give you two more clear reasons as to why local electoralism is the way as compared to what we heard from our opening. The first step, as well as being able to possibly implement some solutions at the local level, the main benefit of when you do hold office at the local level is you demonstrate an aura of seriousness, which is quite important for fringe parties, which so far have been talked about basically as jokes. So to use the example of the most effective transition from fringe movement to power in recent political history, the Five-Star Movement in Italy, which started out as like message boards and is now the most powerful force in the country, their ability to hold office and hold city councils and not just break everything and burn everything overnight, make them seem legitimate and serious. I think that's the biggest barrier that fringe movements face, and that legitimation is important and should be discussed more. The second is that we think there's a lot of local strongholds where for a variety of either ethnic or socio-political or historical reasons, fringe movements do gather in one particular local area. I don't have time to go into the history of communism in India and how it's gone through electoral and non-electoral phases, but basically the region of Kerala has a huge stronghold of local communist support, and the example Shakked used in the POI was the mayor of Trivandrum, a city of over 1 million people. And I think in that context, those local strongholds are really important in building up a level of support that you wouldn't get if they were just sort of the fifth person running in a particular parliamentary seat. We think that idea of local strongholds wasn't talked about enough. We just got this broad characterization, local politics is weird and sometimes wackos get elected. We think that wasn't probably the best way to frame how they get that success. But that's opening out of the way. I want to talk about my more fun, yarny stuff here. So the first is the idea of direct action as a direct alternative to any form of electoralism. Like we talked about, fringe groups generally are either a single issue in the sense of having one thing that they're sort of quite seriously obsessed about, whether it's ban 1080 and 1080, or social credit and monetary policy, or they advocate for the interests of a specific group, generally an ethnic or cultural group, who are on the fringe. We agree with Shakked that African American politics in the US or Māori politics in New Zealand probably is out of scope, but there are lots of other countries where fringe movements like that do have a particular ethnic or local basis, and we think in those contexts, direct action as compared to sort of a form of either electoralism is the most effective way to go. Why is that? Firstly, their main benefit and their main way they rally support isn't from implementing anything overnight, it's from the moral clarity of their message. These are generally very big picture messages that do try to fundamentally reframe the way we conceive of politics entirely, and that's a message that basically is crouched fundamentally in universalist rhetoric that doesn't sit well with having to either run in national elections or win a local seat and deal with like garbage pickups from the council, right? We think the idea of moral clarity is really important. We also think that the opening half in this sense really narrowed the focus into the idea of the barrier being media attention, right? We think that literally exists in the era of social media, that moral clarity can be really easily spread through social media, and in that context, it's a really effective way to get your direct action message across, and you can do that without participation in electoralism. This looks like the huge protest in Belarus the other year, right? Where the main challenger to Lukashenko was not someone who came up through either form of electoral politics. It was literally a blogger who just went around the country and recorded YouTube videos of him meeting with ordinary Belarusians, and it was like, this is really great, this is the kind of political leadership and moral clarity we want. We don't think either of the electoral solutions outside of the House would particularly help it. The other thing as well is that a lot of these issues are ones where there probably is a lot of general buy-in for the broad thrust of what they're about, but they probably don't want to, but voters don't want to make that their sole focus. So the number of people in New Zealand who would like to ban 1080 is significantly higher than the number of people who vote for the ban 1080 party because it's not their first priority. What this does is when you participate in either local or national elections, it artificially makes your movement seem a lot smaller than it is. Because suddenly you've got a quantifiable number, and now you think, oh, only 0.3% of the population wants to ban 1080. Well, it's literally hundreds of times that amount. It's just not people's first preference, which is the only thing that registers when they go into a voting booth. Electoralism deflates the moral clarity and the perceived consensus around these effective groups. I'll take a POI now from,
Abstention from politics is often prefaced on convincing your movement to be anti-establishment. Do you not think that is more likely to lead to extremist action, including violence, and therefore turn mainstream voters and politicians away from it?
Not particularly. We think a lot of people generally do buy into effective moral and universalist rhetoric. We also think that, and we'll get into rejection of institutions now actually. The point here is that a lot of, when you move this sort of debate outside of Western liberal democracies, we see a lot of situations where the politics that is fringe is because it's literally anti-constitutional in the sense of wanting to break up the established constitutional order and the structure of the state. This looks like secessionist groups for minorities, this looks like Sinn Féin wanting to unite Ireland, and the problem here is their entire base and their entire support comes from their rejection of any governing institutions, because they view the things that they would be participating in as fundamentally at their core illegitimate. And that's where their core support comes from, right? So the problem with any kind of engagement with electoralism for these particular groups is firstly, they basically lose all their core support at the point at which they tacitly endorse the regime they're trying to take down. This is the reason why Sinn Féin participates in local Irish politics, but not in national British politics, because they wouldn't want to swear an oath to the Queen, for example. The other problem as well is that at the point at which this sort of politics enters the electoral sphere, it also attracts the attention of authorities who can sometimes literally just hit them with sedition charges, right? And in that context, the idea of just advocating for direct action through decentralized social media, which we've seen just literally any example of the past 20 years of social unrest, which tends to be effective and far more effective these electoral challenges, we think is a much better way to go. We were never particularly told why in these particular contexts people gain any kind of support from undermining their core methods to begin with. Proud to propose.
Communism, or deport the Algerians, or Basque independence. None of them are good answers to the question, a dog has bit my kid, or could we please change the recycling day? These are questions which are important on a national level, and people take seriously on a national level. And that's going to be the thrust of the extension from closing opposition. That is to say that the role and responsibilities of national and regional and local governments impact voters' expectations for what should operate politically. We think given those different roles and responsibilities, fringe or marginal political opinions tend to be more successful in, say, national parliaments than, say, regional parliaments or local city councils. Okay, so I'm going to walk through that. I'm going to talk about expectations of local governance. I'm going to talk about why we think that's the important metric to consider the debate rather than some of the questions we hear from our opening. And then I'm going to talk about pricing. Because I think another reason why opening really falls out of this debate is they really take things quite unseriously. In the midst of domestic political security crises, there is often very real opportunities for parties that seem fringe. The Japanese Communist Party used to seem fringe, but now has 20% of the Japanese Parliament, or the Front National in France, which you seem to be very weird, and is now a competitive presidential contender. And I think in that context, that'll be sufficient for closing opposition to win the debate. On expectations of local governments, people are not concerned with grand ideological or constitutional or paradigmatic shifts on a local level, because they have to worry about rubbish removal and water management and buses. Why is it that those are questions that happen on the local level? Two reasons. One, that's what national parliaments feel comfortable devolving to a national level, because it's a threat to their security and sovereignty when grand paradigmatic questions and national constitutional questions get devolved to a local level. See Spain. And also, that's where the major benefits of localism kicked in. It is efficient to have local water management because it is inefficient for a national parliament to consider every water management system. Question. I think then it is instructive, and I think it has been under-analysed at this point in the debate, to consider this whole question from the perspective of the voter, which is relevant here when we're having questions about elections, right? What do voters care about when they go into the polling booth? Because if a local city council or regional parliament only has day-to-day practical questions of water management, rubbish management, or that sort of thing, those are the kinds of questions and rubrics on which they will analyse the politicians sitting before them. So what does that mean in practice? A few examples. The Italian Communist Party, when it was successful in the 1960s and 70s, was far more successful on a national level than on a local level. Because while communism might have been the appropriate question to consider in response to rolling economic and domestic crises questions, it was not an appropriate response to the questions of dogs walking underground Rome. You just wanted a normal, straightforward politician who did not consider everything through a national paradigmatic lens. It is why the Scottish National Party, oddly, does significantly better in elections to the Westminster National Parliament than in elections to the local Holyrood in Scotland, because when voters in Scotland are going to vote in the national Westminster election, they are considering the grand paradigmatic constitutional landscape question, and that draws them to parties who ask those questions rather than consider the day-to-day issues. Shakked.
So what's to stop a local politician being like, here's my position on this local issue? But also, if you have a moment, I'd like to talk to you about how your boss is probably exploiting you. Like, why can't you just do both?
Because I only want to hear about water management when I'm voting on a local level, right? Because if I go on, say, to Dunedin City Council election and A grade says, hey, I want to legalise marijuana, also I'll do the dog stuff, I suddenly have far less faith in his ability to do the dog stuff. Right? I think that seems obvious, but maybe I've got it wrong. Okay. Now, why does, and I actually found this quite disappointing from opening government. They seem to think a lot of these parties with jokes, but oftentimes what we see in political history is that these parties very quickly do not become jokes. Because in the midst of certain crises, parties who appear fringe are often able to take advantage of the moment in national elections and suddenly become quite successful. Three kinds of crises. Economic crisis. Bob Jones took a hard libertarian party in 1984 out of nowhere to 10% of the vote. An MMP, he would have a significant share of the national parliament. The Italian communists, in response to rolling economic crisis and national security crisis in the 60s and 70s, went from nowhere to 20% of the vote in the Italian parliament. During security crises, for example, if there is, say, an Islamic terrorist attack hypothetically in France, you might see a national fascist movement effectively become one of the most competitive political parties in France, seemingly out of nowhere. And obviously, federal oppression leads to significant growth in these political... I've already taken this shit. Obviously leads to growth in parties like Basque and Catalonian nationalist movements and national parliaments there. So what we see as the appropriate context to consider this debate is, how does a fringe political movement best position itself to take advantage of crises when they occur, and we argue they regularly occur. We argue that it makes most sense to consider them at a national level, where voters feel more comfortable to consider grand paradigmatic constitutional questions, because that is the natural position of those questions to take place. On closing government, right, they consider direct action as an appropriate comparative for responses. Firstly, it is very difficult to take direct action if you are in the wrong paradigm to do so. It's very difficult to set up communism in a country which rejects communism even on a local level. Secondly, getting elected brings resources and funding. It means you get $100,000 and you get to hire John BP effectively. And that's important because he can do stuff like issue press releases or organise campaign meetings and stuff like that. Thirdly, electoral and campaign experience is very important. It means understanding how to allocate resources, volunteers, how to get the best candidates and the right electorates around the country and target the best voters and not have the best campaign strategy. If you miss out on that for 20 years, you miss a lot of that campaign experience on the ground. And fourthly, I just think you can do both. Which is to say that outside of election years, there are no elections to contest. So you do direct action then, right? And that kind of mutual exclusivity isn't there. I think oftentimes the cheap volunteer base gives you pretty good opportunities to do, say, midweek meetings and that sort of thing. Probably the kind of thing economists like Belworthy that go along to. Outside of election years. So, where do we get to at the end of this? You know, it's not about numbers, as our opening would say, because if you aggregate across all the regional parliaments, they have the same number of voters in national parliament. It's not about media. You have to aggregate all the local media with the same amount of attention as the national media. The question is, what do voters consider? And on a local level, voters do not care about paradigmatic questions, but in the midst of crises, they are very often considered.
I always thought Joe liked me, but then he made a mistake and didn't get to our extension until there was like a minute to go in his speech. That's going to harm that team, and I'm going to explain why. So what am I going to talk about in the speech? First, I'm going to take care of Joe. Then, I'm going to talk about what we brought you, which was direct advocacy, and that was a unique benefit we brought in this debate, which is zealot. And I'm also going to talk particularly about how even if you get into national politics, you don't necessarily carry out your aims. So it's pointless even if you got in there. So that team's whole desire for you to get into national politics doesn't even necessarily work. They did the work to show you could get in there, they didn't show what would happen when you did. Okay, so let's just deal with Joe. And that team comes out, their extension is, well, the reason it's better to go for national politics is people think that these issues are important nationally, whereas they don't locally. And that's wrong. First, I'm going to talk about the local aspect of it. And look, as a proud employee of the Greater Wellington Regional Council, I think Joe's got it kind of wrong when he talks about what the local boards and electorates do, right? The local corporation that is the council handles the day-to-day dog and that sort of thing, right? The council doesn't even see that. What the Mayoralty does is set the theme for how Wellington should work. Going forward, should our transport be equality focused, or should we try and rush people to key areas? Should we focus on an environmental movement, or should we try and push an idea that Wellington's a housing city? So when people come to vote in local elections, they actually vote for the themes that they believe in. Maybe they're an empathetic person and think that the city should be geared to its lowest members. Maybe they're a person who's uniquely right-wing conservative and thinks the city should focus on being an economic hub and people who can't pull themselves up should move out, right? So big themes matter locally, particularly because most people feel isolated by the national movement and feel like the country stays the same while the politician changes, so they don't actually vote on their national themes because they don't see the point in that, right? Okay. But additionally to that, Joe forgets all that Taran talked about this debate's not just about the local Wellington Council. This debate, we see it in countries where you have successionists, where there are different states, where you might become the mayor of a city that has a population larger than this country. The impact of a theme there, of communism or something like that, is vital and able to reach people, right? And it was also just factually incorrect that fringe parties do better in national elections. Like the two examples Joe gave me was communism winning in a time when communism wasn't a fringe issue, everyone was talking about it, and the Scottish system where the reason they do better in Westminster is because it's first past the post, while Scotland is proportional, right? He didn't actually prove that they do better, whereas historically we can see that they do worse. And I'm going to bring just a couple of reasons there. Additionally to what everyone said,
The problem is, when fringe parties run, they end up failing. And as they fail, they explode and make themselves look bad because they run people who try and draw attention and they do last-ditch efforts to get support, but they're not very good at that. It's like Judith Collins, in the week before she lost this election, blamed fat people, right? Like, that's the kind of thing they do. It turns people off your party. It's vicious. That's what people see. But secondly, you just look dumb because someone asked you a question. Like, remember that libertarian guy in the United States was asked what he thought he would do about Russia or something, and he didn't even know where a particular country was? That ruins you too. So you don't get in. And even if you do get in, you don't carry out your policy. Like, can Joe honestly tell me a fringe group that got in that communised the nation, like, specifically happened? Now, why don't you carry out your policy? 3 reasons here. First, because you've got to deal with being in fucking government. You've got to run the civil service. You've got 100 different things you have to deal with. Perhaps you've got to negotiate a trade deal with another country. Maybe another country declares war on you. It's very hard to focus on communism when you're dealing with the day-to-day aspects of running a government. Second, you don't win full power, so you've got to negotiate and trade off with other people. And also, power corrupts. You might just like being Prime Minister now, and now you want to keep that power, so you've got to appease others. Maybe you've got to balance and moderate yourself. That means you don't actually get to carry out your worldview. And remember, they see your worldview as specific and changing. You don't make that specific change when you're a government politics. So how do you make that specific change? And this was the stuff that we brought you. We talked about how if you move away from national electorates, yes, you can focus on local elections in some kinds, and we said particularly if you're focused on local elections in some kinds, we said particularly if you've got a local stronghold. And remember, this debate is not just in the West. Let's talk about areas where there is tiny ethnic majorities in certain communities that literally aren't talking about the national level. It's good to focus on local elections there. It's good to run that. And also an example there that Taran gave me is the anti-airport party. They chose to form a national party instead of advocate locally, and they lost all their money. They could have had a court challenge. And let's go into direct action now. Look, first, it is mutually exclusive. Why? Because if you run for a national election, you have to get support. You have to pay money to join up to whatever, like civil service thing you have to in order to say you're a party running for national election. You might have to run ad campaigns around the country, right? You lose support, but also you look stupid when you answer bad questions. You look bad when you flail on TV and insult people. You lose support and you appear weaker than you are because people don't want to vote for you. What's the value in direct action? You can do a bunch of different things. Like, they see direct action is not powerful. Look at the yellow jacket protest in France, right? If you generate mass support and appeal to the innate nature of people, you can push a specific ideology, right? But also, it depends on certain states. Like, say you're a communist, to use the favourite example in this debate. If you win the mayoralty of a town, or you become, if you become a particularly influential YouTube blogger in a certain city or a certain state, you can advocate for the local government to deregulate certain things, or apply better housing policy, or care for the homeless. And note that a lot of people are radicalised because of things happening locally. A lot of people become communist, socialist, or right-wing because of things they see in their community. So when you're in the position to advocate locally, you actually care about that change and can make it because you can connect with others. And finally, our other significant contribution they spent no time responding to was why you hate the system and you wish to tear it down and destroy it. And this is an actor, like, this is a debate. We are the people. We think we should do something. If you think that the system is horrible, corrupt, turned against you, you wouldn't get involved in it because then you can't criticise it because you are it. But also it just weakens your support. For example, say you win a national seat, half of your Communist Party or your Sinn Féin or your secessionists might think you've abandoned the cause by joining with the bad guys. So you divide your own party so you don't win again. You lose support. Your message becomes diluted. Look, we proved to you, even if you get in, you don't carry out your benefits. We proved to you direct action is something you should focus on, and it is generally exclusive. We told you how you win local elections. They should have been spent more than a minute.
Keir and Taran's direct action is you stop traffic during rush hour
wave around guns, smash and shop windows, and that somehow convinces people that your movement is legitimate, worth listening to, and the mainstream politicians who have to hear the neighbourhood concerns as they rebuild the damage you invoke, take you seriously and take on board your claims. Ridiculous, not mechanised, they give you very few examples. That's the first thing I'm going to do, because they claim you don't respond to them. I'm going to respond to CG, I'm going to explain why we should win the case without extension, and finally some responses to OG. There are multiple problems with closing government providing the extension that they do. The first one, very obviously, is that though Keir complains that this is a unique contribution to debate, correct, they're the ones who brought it up, unfortunately it's not a unique mechanism that either side of the House can claim to be exclusively theirs. Because first of all, politicians who participate at a national level might be involved in reasonable protests on the local level outside of election years, as Joe says, and Keir chooses to ignore because obviously it's relatively fatal for their case. But crucially, when you do so as part of a party that's already running, that tends to constrain your direct action into things that are viewed as more legitimate to the public. It discourages things like violence, but crucially, if that direct action is protest organised by party infrastructure, you have much more control over those protests remaining safe, non-violent, remaining reasonable, and you have control of them. Crucially also, you then have a structure which, when the press asks for comment from those protesters, is already in place to make sure the direct action that does occur can be credited specifically to members of your party that you are then putting forward in national races. So, not exclusive here, but crucially, the particular way that they propose direction to occur outside of the control of an organised party infrastructure is likely to be particularly damaging to the legitimacy of the movement they're proposing, which is to say, unorganised rioting without clear figureheads who have responsibility for that group at a national level makes those groups more likely to commit protests, which is particularly illegitimising. But crucially here, their mechanism is different to opening government, right? Closing government stands for not running what's very politically racist by the sounds of it. But there's multiple problems with that. First of all, given the context we provide you, that in crises there's the possibility for otherwise fringe movements to take national control and have massive impact on the national conversation, closing government misses out on that opportunity. They cannot seize that chance because they refuse to run. But crucially, even if they did then decide last minute to run, they had none of the experience to do so. Running campaigns is complicated and is a skill that collectively is honed by a party over a very long period of time. The relationships with the media are built up. Your understanding of what you need to do to engage meaningfully with the media, meaningfully with voters, of how to actually run grassroots campaigns is something you build up over time. Closing government eradicates that skill base, right? By saying we're not going to run because we're busy bashing in, shop front windows and our yellow jackets in France. As a side note, the yellow jacket movement has been deeply unsuccessful, achieved none of its mainstream political aims. They're very long agenda of multiple bullet points was both long and completely unimpactful because not a single one of those ridiculous claims ever got through. Particularly volatile, illegitimising protest turns off the public, both because it's violent and creates destruction, but crucially the public expects people to make change through electoral means or peaceful protest, which first of all said you can't guarantee peaceful protest, but they actively avoid those means to make change in society that voters accept and view as reasonable. So you damage their society and you tell them that their way of operating society is unreasonable and you're not interested in it. A direct slap in the face to voters, that's why CG's case doesn't work. On to our extension here. Why do you think this is more important than open oppositions, and why do you think we should win? Firstly, because the number of the media issues are relatively symmetrical. The reason we should win is because specifically what voters want and expect at a national level is serious, major questions about what society should look like. On a local level, as I'm joking, I think very clearly Appy points out the dog issue, people don't expect it. To give you another example, if you're voting for the district health board or the people to run your local school, there's an expectation they manage your children's lives or how health services operate. Those are quite important issues to you, but they're also relatively mundane. We think it would be quite shocking, off-putting for a voter who's looking for someone to run their local school board who also had niche views on the structure of society at large, because it's simply not what people expect your role and your remit to be, and that therefore makes you seem much more radical than the idea itself may be, just because it is so out of place within that system.
Right.
Crucially, within the context of crises, where structure of society changes rapidly, that is when those fringe movements have the opportunity to massively take power and make impact. You have to participate in the national race to make gains in that. The response we get from closing government is that this doesn't matter because you can't have change in those moments, you're only in the national government. Well, you're in the
national government, right? That means a coalition with other parties, the ability to negotiate. Very crucially, if you're a crisis and you've sucked up 10 or 15% of that vote is cut away from other parties who now lack the majority to govern without you. This ability to make policy with those people. For example, of where this has been effective, the Communist Party in France has been in national coalitions. The Alternative for Deutschland Party in government says maintaining national power has massively increased the rate of deportations of illegal migrants from Germany. Those are policy wins specifically for those groups that are only possible by taking advantage of the crisis of being in the national conversation and seizing power.
Right.
Crucially, what we hear in NPCG is that power is too corrupt and you simply mustn't participate. Bizarre, weird to come out from RIP, presumably power applies at the mayor level when you run 100,000 or 100% strong power, you don't have social responses are good enough. Yes.
So we explained why people are more receptive to new ideas at the departisanized local level. Doesn't that let you capture hearts and minds that you can then use to springboard to the national level when crises happen?
No. First of all, now I'm ready to deal with your case. The first problem is our case directly responds to yours because we've got structural reasons why we're not responsive to new, weird, fringe ideas about the meaning of society when you're electing someone to run your children's education or to manage your elderly grandmother's care in the hospital community. So crucially, we think because you're expecting mundane aspects of your personal life to be managed by people, that is exactly when you are not receptive to those ideas. So we think our case directly clashes with your there. The second thing is, even if you do win those local blank cases, we do not think that OG provides a mechanism for explaining why you legitimise your ideas if you get voted in on council, such that you can subsequently trigger a communist White House. Crucially because, unless you have a majority in that area, you're not actually going to ever get the communist change that allows people to see your communist policy in action meaningfully, that then allows people to start to begin to view those ideas as legitimate. Simply the domino effect to a communist White House is far too unclear. It's unclear why a communist DHB board member may be receptive to a communist and would be very proud to oppose.
Belworthy.